It began with the mist. Not the kind that drifts lazily over a river, but the kind that feels alive. A pale, breathing thing that rises from the cold earth and clings to every surface it touches. On the outskirts of the fjordside city of Idem, that mist had been there for days. It hung between the birch trees and over the frozen ground like a quiet warning. On a gray morning in late November 1969, a father and his two daughters were hiking through the valley below Mount Rosna, following a narrow trail that twisted through pine and rock. The man was looking for a shortcut home before the light disappeared. The children were laughing, their voices swallowed by the wind. Then one of them screamed. What they found in the hollow was not something a child should ever see. At first, the father thought it was a mannequin. The way the shape lay still, the arms bent at unnatural angles, the face darkened beyond recognition. But when he stepped closer, the smell struck him. Burnt metal, melted plastic, and something unmistakably human. The figure was lying among the stones, half covered in charred grass. The ground around her was blackened. Beside her, a few scattered belongings had survived the fire. A silver ring, a fragment of a dark blue bottle, a broken umbrella frame. The most curious thing was the smell of fuel, faint but persistent, even after days of rain. The police arrived within the hour. By the time they reached the site, the mist had thickened. It moved like a veil through the valley, blurring the outlines of every tree. Cameras clicked. Notebooks opened. A cordon of white tape was drawn between the pines. No one spoke much. The scene felt sacred in a way none of them could name. The body was that of a woman, perhaps in her 30s, perhaps older. Her clothing was mostly destroyed, the labels cut out. No papers, no bag, no wallet. Her face had been exposed to the fire long enough to erase every trace of who she'd been. The detective in charge, a quiet man named only in the reports as the inspector, stood a long time without writing anything. He noticed the details others missed. The melted plastic bottle still half filled with a clear liquid that smelled like kerosene. The way the woman's body was positioned almost deliberately, as though someone had arranged it after death. When they searched the nearby slope, they found a half-buried suitcase. Inside, a few items of clothing, all with the tags removed. A comb, a small bottle of lotion labeled in German, and a notebook filled with numbers and letters that made no sense. Every page contained strange sequences: 3-17BL, 5-23HV, 1 to 1 foot, written in block capitals, as if the writer had tried to disguise her handwriting. The inspector closed the notebook carefully. "Codes," he said softly. News of the discovery spread fast. By evening, the city paper had printed a small column. Burned woman found near Rosna. Identity unknown. The article ran without a photograph. There was nothing to photograph that could still be shown. That night, the inspector stood in his small office at the station, staring at the evidence laid out on his desk under a yellow lamp. The ring, the melted bottle, the coded notebook. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever this woman had been, she hadn't come here by accident. He poured himself coffee and opened the suitcase again. At the bottom, tucked behind the lining, he found a piece of paper that someone had tried to tear up. He smoothed it out. It was a hotel receipt from the coastal town of Storns, dated 2 weeks earlier. The name on the register was F. Lean. The handwriting, neat, deliberate, didn't match any known samples. He looked again at the coded notebook. The first entry read, Storns, 1 to 1 foot. At the Grand Hotel in Storns, a small fishing town 50 miles south, the clerk still remembered her. She'd checked in alone. Tall, dark hair, well-dressed. She spoke softly in an accent that no one could place, European but not from anywhere in particular. She carried 2 suitcases, paid in cash, and declined housekeeping. She used different names, the clerk said when shown the receipt. That time she was Miss Lean, but earlier that month she was Miss Fern. Always something with an F. The inspector noted it down. The clerk went on. She kept to herself. But she was polite. The sort of person you remember because she didn't want to be remembered. At the police lab, they examined what remained of her body. The coroner determined she had died from a combination of smoke inhalation and poisoning, the latter likely from sleeping pills found near the scene. Her fingerprints were clean. Her teeth suggested expensive dental work, the kind not done locally. No one in Idem or Storns or anywhere in the surrounding districts reported a missing woman. Not a wife, not a traveler, not a neighbor. It was as if she'd appeared out of thin air. The inspector began tracing her movements backward through hotel records and train tickets. The pattern emerged slowly, like a ghost walking through fog. Over 6 weeks, she had stayed in at least 6 different towns across Norway and Denmark, always under a new name, always paying in cash, always leaving before anyone could remember her. At one hotel, she'd shared the dining room with a group of British engineers. At another, she'd spent an hour speaking in French to a man no one could later identify. And in each place, when she left, she took everything. No fingerprints, no personal photos, no trace of herself. In one station locker, they found another suitcase linked to her by the same handwriting on a tag. Inside were wigs, makeup, and several pairs of tinted glasses. Also a prescription bottle labeled in Italian. It was enough to draw the attention of the national police. By mid-December, rumors were spreading. Some said she was a spy, others a runaway. Some believed she had been part of something political. The Cold War was still simmering, and foreign agents often passed quietly through the Nordic ports. But the inspector, though quiet by nature, refused to chase speculation. He went back to the valley. The snow had begun to fall again, covering the burned ground in white. He crouched where her body had been found, feeling the frozen soil beneath his gloves. Something in the arrangement of the scene bothered him, not the violence but the control. Whoever she had been, she hadn't fought. There were no signs of struggle. The matches found near her had her fingerprints. Had she done this to herself? Or had someone made it look that way? He looked up. The mist was rolling in again, just as on that first day. It crawled across the stones like a living memory. In the distance, the sound of church bells echoed from the city, low and tired. He whispered to the empty valley, "Who were you?" The inspector's report remained methodical. Burned body, female, unknown origin, death by smoke and poison. But between the lines, his notes carried unease. The pattern of travel, the coded notebook, the lack of identity. It all felt rehearsed, like the final act of a life lived under disguise. One detail haunted him most. The shoes she wore. Expensive Italian leather, barely damaged by the fire. Someone who valued appearance even at the end. He kept her ring on his desk. Silver, thin, engraved faintly with 3 letters SLR. No one ever claimed it. Weeks passed. The city moved on. The story faded into rumor, then silence. But for the inspector, the case refused to rest. At night, he dreamed of the mist rolling over the hills, of a faceless woman walking through train stations with a suitcase full of names. He returned once more to the suitcase evidence, looking for something he'd missed. The coded notebook, the lotion bottle, the fragments of burned cloth. He ran his fingers over the faint smell of perfume that still lingered, even after months. It was the kind of scent one wore to disappear, subtle, clean, hard to trace. In one corner of the notebook, he noticed a faint indentation from a pen that had pressed too hard. Under light, the words became visible. "Remember the valley." He froze. The valley, the same place where she died. Had she known? Had she chosen it? The possibility changed everything. If she had come there willingly, it wasn't a murder scene. It was an ending she'd written herself. But why? He began searching for others who might have known her. At the border station, a customs officer recalled her face, or thought he did. She asked if she could take photographs of the mountains, he said. Said she was a student of art history, but no records matched that claim. Another remembered her on a ferry, sitting alone, reading a book in German. The title, The Double Life. The inspector wrote it down, then paused. He looked again at the coded notebook. 1 to 1 foot, 3-17 BL, 5-23 HV. Could these be travel routes? Hotel rooms? Meeting points? or simply the coordinates of a life spent in constant motion. The trail led nowhere. Every clue seemed to dissolve the closer he looked. On the first anniversary of her discovery, the inspector visited her grave. The city had buried her quietly, under a simple stone that read, "Unidentified woman, 1969. A small vase of flowers sat beside it. Someone had been there before him. The petals were still fresh. He looked around. No one. Just wind moving through the winter grass. He thought of her last hours. The suitcase packed. The coded notebook closed. The match struck in the dark. And the silence afterward, the kind that follows only when a secret has finally been kept. In the archives, the case file still exists. A collection of photographs faded at the edges, a notebook of codes no one has ever cracked, and a ring that once meant something to someone. People in Item still speak of her now and then, when the mist returns to the valley. They call her the woman with no name. They say that on certain mornings, when the fog lies thick and the air smells faintly of fuel, you can almost see her silhouette among the pines. Not as a ghost, but as a question still waiting for an answer. And maybe that's what she became. Not a body, not a mystery, but a kind of mirror. A reminder of how easily a life can vanish. Not just in fire, but in silence. The inspector never solved it. He retired years later, his desk empty except for the small silver ring and a note scrawled on the back of a report. Some stories end not with truth, but with mercy. And every winter, when the valley fills again with smoke and mist, people remember her. The burned woman with no name, who lived and died beneath a sky that forgot her face. In winter, Item becomes a city of glass and silence. The harbor freezes at the edges, trapping reflections of cranes and smokestacks beneath a thin layer of ice. The air carries the smell of salt and cold metal. It was there, beneath that pale horizon, that the inspector returned to the case, though officially it had long been closed. He no longer wore the uniform. Retirement had softened his posture, grayed his hair, and thinned his patience. Yet the woman from the valley still followed him, through dreams, through newspapers folded at breakfast, through the hollow quiet of an apartment too small for the weight of unanswered questions. He kept her photograph, the one taken before the fire, on his desk. It wasn't much. Just a reconstruction sketch the forensics team had made from fragments of bone and skull. A woman's face, composed of guesswork and compassion. The eyes were closed. Every morning, he found himself staring at it longer than he meant to. The case file had been boxed and sealed, but he reopened it in secret. Years had passed since the first reports, yet the paper still smelled faintly of ash. He began again from the beginning, the suitcase, the coded notebook, the ring. When he lifted the notebook, he noticed something he had missed the first time. Along the spine, barely visible under the faded paper, was an embossed manufacturer's mark. M.K. Hamburg. It was German. He wrote the name down. Later that week, he traveled to Hamburg under the pretense of visiting relatives. He carried only one bag and the notebook. The stationery shop had changed hands since the 60s, but the old owner's son still remembered the brand. Those were popular with students and travelers, he said, running a finger over the cover. But this model, the one with the reinforced spine, that was special order. Usually bought in bulk by government departments or large companies. Do you remember any particular buyers? The man thought for a long moment, then shook his head. No names, only that they paid in cash. Always cash. Outside, the inspector stood beneath a gray Hamburg sky, watching people hurry past, each face belonging to someone with a name, an address, a story. And yet the woman he sought seemed to have erased herself from all of it. Still, the notebook had crossed this city once. Perhaps she had too. Back in Item, he began combing through immigration logs and hotel registries once more. Most were now digitized, though incomplete. He found the same pattern as before: false names, brief stays, vanishing departures. But this time something new emerged. At a hotel near the capital, a record dated just 2 days before her death listed a woman named M. Feldman. The handwriting matched. The note in the margin read, "Met with man at breakfast. Foreign accent." The manager remembered her well. She spoke several languages, he said over the phone. Norwegian, German, French. Switched between them as if trying them on. The man she met, I thought he was American, maybe British. Tall. Gray suit. I never saw him again. The inspector asked what they discussed. Something about delivery, the manager said. Or return. Couldn't hear clearly. She seemed nervous, but not frightened. More like someone preparing to leave. Did she say where she was going? No. Only that she was tired of traveling. That night, the inspector couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the lights of ships move slowly through the fjord. Somewhere out there had been a meeting, perhaps the last one of her life. He reopened the coded notebook. 3-17 BL. 5-23 HV. 7-04 RN. He read them aloud softly, as if speaking to her ghost might help. Then it struck him, what if the letters were not random but locations? He took out a map. The first code, 3-17 BL, could fit the pattern of latitude and initials. He placed a finger near Bergen, BL. The numbers roughly matched a date she had stayed there. The second, 5-23 HV, might mean Havens, a harbor town. Each code aligned with one of her known stops. But the last entry, 7-04 RN, had never been found in her travel logs. He circled it in red. Weeks turned into months. The inspector's notes grew thicker than the official file ever had. He traced shipping manifests, bus tickets, even advertisements for the lotion bottle she'd carried. Nothing led to a name. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived at the station addressed simply to the officer who found her. The handwriting was neat and foreign. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and a photograph. The photograph showed a young woman sitting on a stone wall beside a harbor. She was smiling faintly, the kind of smile people give when they think no one is looking. Behind her, a ferry's name was just visible, Ranafjord. On the back, 3 words were written. She remembered too much. The inspector's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. It read, "You will not find her name. She was one of many who walked between shadows. When the world chose sides, she refused both. They called her by numbers, not words. Tell them she was kind." There was no signature. The name Ranafjord, the ferry, matched the code 7-04 RN. It had been the last entry in her notebook. He searched records from the ferry company. Only one passenger list survived from that summer. Among the names, Marina Felton, traveling alone. The description matched the woman perfectly. And so the pattern closed. She had taken the ferry from the capital to Ranafjord, arrived quietly, and disappeared into the valley 2 days later. But the letter's phrase, "walked between shadows," lingered. Who were they? And why had she refused them? Through an old contact in the foreign ministry, the inspector gained access to declassified cables from the late 1960s. He read for days lists of agents, diplomatic movements, intercepted communications. In one memo, partially redacted, he found a line that stopped his breath. Subject, female courier, multiple aliases, F series, neutralized contact, believed self-terminated, November 1969. The initials F series. The aliases beginning with F. Couldn't be coincidence. She had been part of something, after all something unspoken, erased before it could ever be acknowledged. The inspector leaned back in his chair. The rain tapped against the window like typewriter keys. He whispered, "So you were real." Over the next weeks, he gathered every piece of her life he could. Hotel receipts, witness statements, photographs. He began to see the faint outline of a person beneath the codes and disguises. She had liked strong coffee. She had favored quiet hotels by the sea. She had bought postcards she never mailed. And though she'd carried wigs and passports, she'd also kept a book of poetry, pages underlined in pencil. One verse repeated twice. To be seen is to be found. To be found is to be lost. The handwriting matched the coded notebook. He read it again and again until it felt like she was speaking through the years. Eventually, the inspector found a linguist willing to examine the notebook. The man was old, patient, with spectacles that magnified his eyes. Together they studied the codes for weeks. Then, one evening, the linguist looked up. "These are not just locations," he said. "They're also dates, and perhaps meetings. But look here, the intervals between entries. Each one is separated by exactly 9 days. That's not travel. That's reporting." Reporting. Yes, she was sending information, probably through dead drops or intermediaries. Each code marks a dispatch, not a destination. So she was working. The linguist nodded slowly. Until she decided to stop. The inspector sat back in silence. The notebook, once meaningless, now seemed alive. A ledger of secrets traded for survival. And yet, at the end, she had written, "Remember the valley." He wondered if that had been her resignation. A final message to those who once owned her. Years later, during a renovation of the old police archives, a technician discovered a sealed envelope tucked into the back of the woman's file. Inside was a small key and a note in the inspector's handwriting. "For whoever comes after me, there is a locker at the central station. The code is the same as her last entry." The technician followed the instructions. In a rusted locker behind a forgotten platform, she found a small metal box. Inside lay the ring engraved SLR, a faded photograph of the reconstructed face, and a single reel of film labeled 1969, Ronafjord. When developed, the film showed 3 frames of landscape: cliffs, water, sky, and one of a man standing beside a car, his face turned away. The final frame was blurry but unmistakable. A woman walking away into the mist, her coat collar high, a suitcase in hand. No one ever identified her. In time, the inspector died quietly, leaving behind no family. His notes were found in a folder marked "The Fragments." Among them was a line written in the margin of his final report. She was not running from something. She was running from everyone who tried to own her. Those words changed how people remembered her. When the story resurfaced years later in a documentary, viewers saw her not as a spy, nor as a victim, but as a woman caught between loyalties, one who chose silence over betrayal. The valley where she died became a symbol of unfinished stories. Some believed she had been silenced by others. Some believed she had silenced herself. But those who read the inspector's notes saw something different: mercy. Every winter, travelers still visit the valley. They bring flowers, small candles, sometimes folded letters left under the snow. No one knows where they come from. Some are written in English, some in German, some in languages no one can read. One message, left last year, said only, "Forgive me for remembering." The mist still gathers there as it always has, low, patient, unhurried. And when it lifts, it reveals the same quiet stones where she once lay, and perhaps still does in spirit. Her true name remains unknown, but her story, the fragments left behind, became something more enduring than any identity. Because in the end, all that remains of a life is what others remember, and what we choose to believe about it. And in that valley, wrapped in fog and silence, a burned spy with no name still whispers her secret. That truth, once found, is never as merciful as forgetting. It was the silence that lasted, longer than any investigation, longer than any rumor. After the inspector's death, his papers were stored in the city archives, in a narrow metal drawer marked private correspondence. No one touched them for years. Dust gathered like gray snow over the files, and the woman's story, once whispered in every newsroom, faded into memory. Then, one spring morning, a young archivist named Ellen was assigned to digitize the older police records. She didn't know what she was looking for. She was just cataloging names and case numbers when she found it. A brown envelope without a label, sealed with brittle tape. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, a ring, and a letter addressed to whoever still wonders. The handwriting was shaky but clear. The inspector's. She took the envelope home that evening. Rain streaked the tram windows, turning the city lights into rivers of color. She read the letter under the weak glow of a desk lamp. If you are reading this, then I have failed to stop thinking about her. For years I believed truth was a matter of evidence, of facts lined up in a row. But some truths live outside the law. They live in the quiet between what we can prove and what we feel. I have always believed she left us a message, not in code, but in mercy. Remember the valley, she wrote. I once thought it meant the place of her death. But I think now she meant something else entirely. The letter ended there unfinished. But in the margin, faintly penciled, were 2 words, "Return north." Ellen frowned. She turned the photograph over. It was a copy of the blurry frame found in the locker, the woman walking away into the mist, the suitcase in hand. Beneath it, the inspector had written, "The truth is in the fog." A week later, Ellen applied for leave. She told no one where she was going. She took a train north along the fjord, through tunnels and forests and the endless gray of early spring. By evening she reached the small village nearest the valley where the burned woman had been found. The locals still remembered the story, though the details had softened into myth. "She comes with the mist," said the innkeeper, pouring coffee. "My grandmother saw her once. Said she was standing by the river, wearing white, like she was waiting for someone who never came." Ellen smiled politely. "Do people still visit the place?" "Sometimes," the woman said. "Mostly foreigners, journalists, the curious. They all go to look for answers, but the valley doesn't give them any." That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. The wind pressed against the windows, whispering through the cracks like a breath too close to the ear. She dreamed of footsteps in fog, of a woman's shadow crossing between trees, of a voice saying softly, "Remember the valley." At dawn, she followed the old trail. It wound through pine and stone, climbing gently toward the ridge. The air smelled of wet moss and wood smoke. The mist hung low, dense enough to feel. Halfway up, she found what she'd come for, the clearing where the woman had been found all those years ago. Time had smoothed it. The scorched earth was gone, replaced by wild grass and birch saplings. Only a small iron cross marked the spot, left there by someone unknown. Ellen knelt beside it. The soil was cold beneath her hand. She stayed there a long time, listening. Birds, the slow drip of meltwater from the rocks, the quiet pulse of the earth. And then something else, a sound like paper shifting in the wind. She turned. Just beyond the clearing, half buried under stones, something caught the light. A small tin box, rusted but intact. She pulled it free. Inside was a roll of film sealed in wax paper, and a folded note. The note was written in the same hand as the coded notebook. "To whoever remembers, you have come far enough. The truth is not in who I was, but in why I chose to end it here. I was not hunted. I was tired. The faces I wore were borrowed. The names temporary. Every truth I carried belonged to someone else. When you live too long without your own, silence becomes the only honest language. Tell him I was grateful he looked for me, but some questions deserve no answers. They are meant to fade, like breath on glass." There was no signature, only the faint outline of 3 letters, SLR. Ellen returned to the city the next morning, carrying the film carefully in her coat pocket. She developed it at the university's lab, watching the images appear slowly in the red light. Most of the frames were overexposed, fragments of sky, water, empty streets. But in one, the focus was perfect. A man standing beside a riverbank, his face turned slightly toward the camera. He was younger then, but unmistakable. The inspector. In the background, blurred but visible, was the same woman, watching him from a distance. Ellen stared at the photograph for a long time. The inspector had never mentioned this. Their lives had crossed before the valley. She went back to the letter, rereading the line, "Tell him I was grateful he looked for me. Grateful not for his investigation, but for something else. For kindness. For being seen." Changed everything. Maybe they had met years earlier, in one of the cities she passed through under another name. Maybe he'd questioned her once, or simply helped her without knowing who she truly was. And maybe, when she chose to vanish, She remembered the one man who had seen her without asking what she owed. Remember the valley, not as a place of death but as a promise, that someone would come back, not to expose her, but to understand her silence. Ellen sat in her apartment that night with the photo in her hands. She imagined the inspector, old and alone, piecing together the fragments of a life he might have touched but never known. She imagined the woman, walking through a world divided by fear, forced to live in shadows she never chose. Maybe she'd worked for both sides once. Maybe for neither. Maybe she was just someone who carried secrets for too long until they burned through her. Whatever she had done, she had ended it her way, not as an escape, but as an act of release. Her coded notebook had been a diary written in language only she understood. Her disguises were not deception, but protection. And her final act, the fire, was not to vanish, but to ensure no one could use her again. The inspector had spent his life searching for truth, but what she'd left behind was mercy. A month later, Ellen returned to the valley one last time. She brought with her the photograph of the inspector and the woman, and the small silver ring. She placed them beneath the iron cross. The mist was rising again, slow, deliberate, like the breath of the earth. As it closed around her, she whispered, "You're remembered." The wind carried the word away. Years later, the photograph found its way into a museum exhibition on Cold War mysteries. It hung in a quiet corner, labeled simply "Unidentified Woman, 1969. Visitors stopped, stared, moved on. But every now and then, someone lingered, drawn not by the intrigue of espionage, but by the faint humanity in the image. Two people who had once seen each other across a divide neither could cross. In the final panel of the exhibition, a quote from the inspector's notes was displayed. "She lived a life made of fragments, truth scattered among disguises. I spent mine trying to put them back together. But perhaps the point was never to solve her. Perhaps the point was to learn what it means to let someone remain unknown, and still care." On the anniversary of her discovery, a candlelight vigil was held for the first time in Idem. Students, journalists, and locals gathered in the valley. The mist rolled down from the hills, soft and heavy. A voice recited her note aloud, the one Ellen had found in the tin box. When the words ended, the silence that followed felt like an answer. Not closure, not truth, something gentler, a recognition that not every life needs a name to be remembered. Ellen stayed behind after the others had gone. She watched the candles flicker, their reflections trembling in the wet grass. For the first time, she understood what the inspector had meant, that some truths live outside the reach of proof. The valley was quiet now. Only the wind moved, carrying the smell of rain and pine. And in that moment, she could almost see them, the woman and the inspector, standing at opposite ends of the mist, not searching, not running, just existing in the same silence that had once separated them. Two souls bound by the same act of mercy, to remember, but not to expose, to understand, but not to claim. In the years that followed, the story faded again, as it always had. But every winter, when the fog returned to the valley and the sound of distant church bells carried across the hills, someone would find fresh flowers at the iron cross. White lilies, tied with a silver ribbon. No one ever saw who left them. Some say it was Ellen long after she'd grown old. Some say it was strangers passing through, drawn by the whisper of a forgotten kindness. And some believe, though they would never say it aloud, that it was the woman herself in whatever quiet beyond we all go to when our names are gone. The valley still breathes. The mist still gathers. And when it does, the ground smells faintly of smoke and rain, as if remembering. Her story remains without an ending, because endings belong to those who live by facts. But for those who live by memory, she is still walking. Somewhere between the pines, suitcase in hand, her face half turned toward the light. And in that soft, endless fog, her voice lingers. Remember the valley, not for what was lost, but for what was forgiven.